This episode of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Patreon supporters and listeners like you. If you enjoy Hellbent for Horror, please consider supporting the show by contributing either on our Patreon site or via PayPal. You can find links to both of those on hellbentforhorror.com. And I thank you for helping to sustain the show. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. Did you hear that? What was that sound? You probably know what movie the sound is from, but what made that sound? What was that? You can tell it's made by a machine, but it also sounds organic, like something alive, something self-aware. And this thing is an excruciating pain. This is a sound born from violence. And we are introduced to this sound in utter darkness. We are also aware that we are not alone in the dark. We know someone is there with us because we can hear them fumbling with something, tearing a package open. We aren't sure. But whoever it is, they do not speak. And we are disoriented and we are tense. And then we hear the sound. There's a flash of light from an old camera. And we see the first images. And we see... What do we see? Are those fingers? The flash fades into darkness before we can be sure. And our level of tension ratchets up. And then that flash and that sound and another quickly fading image happens again. That first 2 minutes of Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a masterclass on how horror works. This is art. If I had to distill that film experience to one thing, it would be that sound. In my mind, that's what it would sound like to hear the hairs on the back of my neck rising. Shooting The Texas Chainsaw Massacre lasted for 32 days. And the story of what happened during those 32 days is legendary. Everyone got hurt, nobody got paid, everyone hated Tobe. And everyone admitted that the heat and the stink and the hours drove them a little crazy. And when principal shooting was over, all of them limped away to lick their wounds. They went home and washed the temporary insanity out of their hair. Except for Tobe Hooper. He stayed with that madness for another year. Hooper turned his living room into an editing room and his bedroom into a music studio. He created a disturbing and atonal industrial soundtrack to match the images. Hooper recorded that iconic sound that chills my bones in his bedroom. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is easily the most divisive of the modern horror films that are celebrated for their influence. Many critics still dismiss it. Why? Well, there's no Oscar-winning director to make critics and historians feel safe to champion it like you do The Exorcist. There's no distinct social commentary for them to hook into like Night of the Living Dead. And there's no elegant Hitchcockian structure to focus on like there was for Halloween. There is only this. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. If you're a mainstream critic, it's risky to embrace something that seems so unsophisticated. So many critics begrudgingly accept the movie as influential, while they carefully sidestep the question of whether it's a great film or not. Then there are the attempts to devalue its reputation. I heard a critic suggest that the only reason Chainsaw got into the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection is that MoMA doesn't refuse any films. Hey, it's true, but why only point that out for this film? Even 43 years later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre still gets underappreciated. It's one of the most well-known movies in history, and yet it's still called a cult film. Some people will never accept that there's any greatness to it. And the same can be said for its creator. Tobe Hooper died of natural causes on August 26, 2017, at the age of 74. And more than any other director of a legendary horror film, Hooper was a divisive figure. Horror fans had the same problem embracing the director that mainstream critics had embracing Chainsaw. Why? Well, he didn't have a solid string of classic films like John Carpenter did. He didn't redeem himself after a series of disappointing movies like Wes Craven did with Scream. He didn't have the defiant independence or the charisma of George Romero. And there was the very public embarrassment of bad business deals and creative control issues that made him look naive. As Tobe Hooper himself said, "I wasn't that deliberate with the creation of my career. I was just focused on the movie to a fault. I was so damn myopic." In a way, Tobe Hooper was the Rodney Dangerfield of horror. If you're a horror fan, it's risky to embrace someone who seems so unsophisticated. Listen, it's understandable if you're underwhelmed by the totality of his filmography, but there's a phenomenon with Hooper that bothers me. It's one thing to dislike the movies that don't work for you, but I've run into many horror fans that devalue his contributions to the ones they do like. It's like he personally offended them by not being the horror genius they hoped he was. He's begrudgingly accepted as a master of horror on the strength of Chainsaw. But over the last decade, I've heard more than one person question just how much the success of that film had to do with him. I've heard it said that the movie worked despite him, and some say it was dumb luck. Now, this isn't coming from mainstream critics. This is coming from longtime horror fans. Why are the criticisms about Tobe Hooper so, shall we say, passionate? I think people misinterpret his very unusual style as incompetence. Hooper may have worked in mainstream horror, but he was not mainstream. He rarely followed a traditional narrative flow. His style and his ideas came from his subconscious mind, and he was determined to recreate that unreal world on film. He couldn't tell you why he created that way, and he'd openly admit he didn't know why. And that made him a man of few words on the set who offered very few explanations. He was a lifelong movie watcher, and he made his movies as a reaction to everything he'd ever seen in films by making the things that he had not seen. Tobe Hooper's films could be horrifying and absurd and beautiful and preposterous all at the same time. They are visceral, unsettling, and sometimes illogical barrages of conflicting emotions. Like the subconscious, you feel his movies more than you understand them. And that is what really makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre so powerful. So, what the hell happened to everything else? I think it's a few things, but for now, I'll sum it up with one sentence. Square peg, round hole. Hooper was on a different wavelength than I think a lot of people in the exploitation horror industry were used to dealing with. They were used to stories that followed a traditional narrative flow and a narrative logic. Basically, a story structure of point A to point B to point C. But Hooper came at horror movies differently, because he didn't start out as a horror director. He started out as an avant-garde director who had the sensibilities of the surrealists. His style had more in common with Louis Buñuel and David Lynch than Alfred Hitchcock and George Romero. When that surreal style first mixed with horror and Chainsaw, it was revolutionary. And I don't think that level of power and intensity has ever been matched. And if the next film he was offered wasn't a horror film, I think he might have been a contemporary of David Lynch. But he became synonymous with horror, and eventually his style was too bizarre for the expectations of mainstream horror. And it might have been inevitable, because surrealism resists definitions and defies any established techniques. Tobe Hooper was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he got started in film as a cameraman on documentaries. He wrote, shot, and directed his first feature film, Eggshells, an American freak illumination. Hooper was a Texas hippie and a pacifist, and that mindset is apparent in this film. It was an avant-garde counterculture film that mixed documentary and absurdist comedy with an experimental film that gets more and more surreal as it goes along. There's a scene where the wind blows a paper airplane out of a street gutter and it glides towards a farmhouse. When it bumps into the house, it explodes in a huge ball of flame and it crashes on the porch. Then, A hippie nonchalantly pours his glass of milk on the fire like this happens every day. Eggshells won some awards, but it didn't get distribution. It did give Tobe a reputation as a talent on the rise, and people wanted to work with him. To get Hollywood's attention, Hooper decided to make his next project a horror film. The cast of the film were unknown Texan actors, and the crew were grad students at the University of Texas, including cinematographer Daniel Pearl. Hooper was the only person with professional film production experience on Chainsaw. And it was a troubled shoot from the very beginning. There was a clash of styles that nearly got Hooper thrown off his own movie by the producer. Hooper was making a horror film that was as surreal as possible, and the producer had no idea what the hell he was trying to do. Nobody was expecting Chainsaw to be anything more than your standard exploitation film. So they must have thought Hooper was nuts when he kept doing these artsy shots. The movie was structured to be like a waking dream, with dream logic stripping away reality. Horror movies had dream sequences in them before, but in Chainsaw, you were in a dream sequence that ran the length of the movie. Having shocking violence juxtaposed with absurd humor and truly bizarre acting choices and that repetitive third act must have looked like a major blunder. This was uncharted territory for a horror movie, and the producers had no frame of reference. Traditional narrative logic was ignored completely for emotional logic. Hooper believed he could use shocking images the same way harmonics are used in music. He slowly stacked images to start a nervous vibration in the audience's subconscious minds. And in doing so, Hooper captured something that looked and felt like genuine madness. Horror had never been so experimental before. There are many reasons for Chainsaw's success. Cinematographer Daniel Pearl did a sublime job, and he fulfilled all of Hooper's crazy requests, including using a microscopic lens on Marilyn Burns' eyeball to see the pulsating veins. The sound design created by Hooper and Wayne Bell matches the madness of the images with a constant ambiance of animal and industrial sounds. But they also had the smarts to keep the soundtrack silent during the kills. They knew we'd be leaning in to listen when the shock hits. The ingenious set design of the interior of the farmhouse by the late Robert Burns turns the place into a hillbilly Hieronymus Bosch painting. It defines cinematically what insanity looks like for every horror film that came after it. Hooper had to persuade Burns to go that route, but once he agreed, I think Robert Burns surpassed anyone's expectations. Of course, the story of Chainsaw doesn't end rosy. The cast and the crew were swindled out of royalties when the producers made a distribution deal with a mafia-run company. And the production was poorly managed by Hooper, which caused injuries and a legendary 26-hour shooting day. In the end, it took Hooper years to repair the friendships that he lost because he stepped over the line one time too often to finish this film. But stuff like this happens all the time in low-budget independent films. Bad producers fuck people out of money, and cast and crew badmouth the director. Chainsaw is unquestionably Tobe Hooper's greatest film. I also think it's his most personal film, and that's why it feels so focused. That's right, the most personal film a pacifist hippie from Texas ever made was about a family of cannibals. In an interview, Tobe Hooper said, "Mothra didn't scare me, Godzilla didn't scare me, it was people, family gatherings that scared me." It turns out, the Saw really is family. Hooper's Wisconsin relatives used to love to scare the hell out of him when he was a child. They not only introduced him to the story of Ed Gein, but also how his uncle once skinned a cadaver's face off and wore it to a medical school Halloween party. Hooper came from a very dysfunctional family. His parents constantly fought until they divorced when he was 8 years old, and the favorite battlefield for these dysfunctional fights was at the dinner table, and the young boy was caught in the crossfire. Let's put this into context. A proper Texas family of the 1940s, where the dinner table is the sacred center of family life. The father is at the head of the table, and he leads the prayer, and he's the first to break bread. And as a child, you didn't leave the table until you were excused. And then the fighting starts, and you are forced to sit there, scared shitless. As Tobe Hooper said, those family dinners can go very wrong. I saw some things growing up that were bizarre and wrong. If there is a point A, B, and C to Chainsaw, point C is when we meet the family. And point C is the most disturbing and most relentless and most surreal part of the film. It is eternal night, and the torment is never ending. The final act is like a skipping record, returning to the same spot repeatedly. No matter how many times Sally escapes, she ends up back where she started. Because we have not yet been excused from the dinner table. In some of the best Tobe Hooper films, there's usually an undercurrent of family dysfunction. Hooper's next film, Eaten Alive, features a family trying to hide their dysfunction from the outside world. Well, there are a shitload of dysfunctions in Eaten Alive. Even though Chainsaw was a hit and got some critical praise, Hooper's phone didn't ring, and he had trouble raising money for a true crime film he wrote. He finally got a call from producers in LA with a script that they wanted him to direct. The script was a low-budget ripoff of Chainsaw, except the location was in a hotel in the bayou and the cannibal cooked stew instead of barbecue. However, there was one detail that Hooper connected with. The main character was loosely based on Joe Ball, a real-life bar owner who killed women and fed them to the alligator in his roadside zoo. Hooper said he'd do the movie if he could rework the script. One of the things Hooper said bothered him about the response to Texas Chainsaw was that initially nobody saw the humor. Everyone was too petrified to notice. Even though the movie was a surreal take on Hansel and Gretel, most reviewers talked about its gritty realism and documentary feel. People certainly weren't going to say that about Eaten Alive. The entire film is shot on a huge soundstage with a water tank to create the swamp. The exterior of the Starlight Hotel is surrounded by fake trees and a fake backdrop. Red stage lights replace natural light, and old-fashioned fog machines crank out way too much fog. This is the start of a stylistic theme that Hooper would use often in his films, where you visually enter a surreal twilight world. It's a place that sunlight never reaches. And life is brutal and unfair, and there is no hope. Eaten Alive is an act of film subversion. It gleefully subverts any traditional narrative expectations. There is no real plot or sense of time. It's more a series of events around a series of characters. Hooper intentionally rejects any sense of reality to immerse us in this surreal nightmare. Most of the main characters wear obvious bad stage wigs, and the acting is really over the top. Everything in the movie is artifice, a facade, and that's what I think makes it brilliant and crazy and darkly funny. You've heard the phrase, "At night is when all the crazies come out," right? We all have our day faces, the ones we show when we go to work and to church and in public. We all unconsciously project the ideal of the model citizen or the model family during the day. But at night, the crazy comes out, and the bars and the brothels fill up, and the dinner table turns into a battlefield. Eaten Alive shows how those ideals, those symbols, crumble in eternal twilight. There are no good Southern boys just trying to have fun. There's no redemption for the prostitute, and masculinity, and, of course, the perfect nuclear family are illusions. And the most disturbing and best sequence in this movie is about family dynamics. There's a family tragedy that involves a dog and a crocodile. You can figure it out. While the mother tries to get her crying daughter to sleep, the father continually apologizes. The acting is intentionally expressionistic and bizarre. The wife stops comforting the child to turn and give her husband a dead-eyed stare. Then she goes back to caring for the child. The husband stops his constant self-flagellation with an angry stare. And then he reaches his hand out towards the back of his wife's head. He doesn't touch it, but he mimics grabbing her head and violently twisting it. And he lets out this horrible hiss of rage that sounds like a balloon slowly losing air. At that moment, everything goes from absurd to unsettling and very creepy. It's a brilliant image that shows the hateful dynamics underneath a failed marriage. The late William Finley played the husband, and he talked about working with Hooper on that scene. Finley said that Hooper would come up with ideas, but he was not strong at explaining the how or the why for the actor, so he'd use hand signals instead, which was confusing and problematic. It was a problem with the producers too, and they questioned Hooper's methods. Ironically enough, that's how David Lynch directed Laura Dern and Naomi Watts in Twin Peaks: The Return. In the end, Hooper walked off the film, and the cinematographer finished it. And unfortunately, Hooper's surreal Twilight world failed to connect with audiences. As a person, Hooper wasn't a charismatic, but he was sweet and kind off the set. And he didn't yell to get his way, and he was an awkward communicator who preferred visuals to words. He was a very Texan guy in the go-go world of L.A., where big talk and bigger personality are the coin of the realm. He didn't epitomize the popular image of a movie director, and I think that colored people's thoughts about him when he made his mistakes. He doesn't act like an artist. He doesn't sound like an artist. Perhaps he's not an artist. Square peg, round hole. And yet, there are moments of pure artistry in all of his work. Take his movie The Funhouse. It's a sturdy horror movie made during the slasher boom of the 1980s, and it has moments of surreal beauty, despite a standard narrative. The golden nugget in this movie revolves around the highly dysfunctional carnival family at the center. In the movie, the son, a man-child, constantly wears a Frankenstein monster mask. The Frankenstein monster is the ultimate child who wants his father's approval. There's a scene where the father denigrates his son and then punishes the son by forcing him to repeatedly beat himself, to bash his own head with his fists. The father mocks the son while he does it, telling him to do it more, do it harder, while the monster cries out in pain and shame. Can you think of a stronger image for how dysfunctional families teach the victim to hate themselves? Tobe Hooper did find mainstream success on television with a great adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. From all accounts, there was no drama on the production, and Hooper was praised for his work. He was surrounded by seasoned television professionals, and he worked from a strong script. Not only was Hooper a great match for the horror in the story, but also for the maladjusted family lives of the townsfolk. There's not a lot of overt surrealism, but when it's there, those are the great moments, like the legendary appearance of Ralphie Glick at his brother's window, for example. Hooper increased the dreamlike quality by shooting portions of the sequence in reverse. My favorite moment, though, is subtle. The caretaker is burying the Glick boy after his funeral, and a hard wind blows by. Without words, we get a feeling that something unseen is mesmerizing the man, commanding him to open the casket and free the undead boy inside. And Hooper upsets the timing. He doesn't cut to another angle, and the moment runs long, uncomfortably long. And when the caretaker finally jumps into the grave, it scares you. Salem's Lot is considered one of the best Stephen King adaptations ever made. It's also one of the best made-for-TV movies ever made. And then, after the moderate success of his next movie, The Funhouse, came the bitch slap heard around the world. Of course, we're talking about Poltergeist, his film collaboration with Steven Spielberg. I'm assuming you've seen the movie, but if you haven't, it's excellent. The movie's quality and influence have never been in dispute. So, I'm going to talk to the dispute. Now, I'm not going to debate whether Poltergeist was directed by Spielberg or by Hooper. I'm just going to talk about how, no matter how you slice it, allowing there to ever be a controversy was a dick move, and how the controversy is about as immaterial as a fart in the wind. So let me first talk to the idea that the movie feels more like Spielberg than it does Hooper. Yeah. So, did you go to the movies anytime between 1980 and 1990? I think context is important here because a lot of this controversy started in the internet era, after the first Spielberg mania of the 1980s. After Jaws and Close Encounters and Raiders of the Lost Ark, Spielberg was a movie god. He joined the rare group of directors who had a style named after them, Spielbergian. In 1982, I didn't know anyone who came out of Poltergeist and said, gee, do you think Hooper actually directed that? It felt pretty Spielbergian. Because by then, everything felt Spielbergian. His style and his tone and his whimsy about children was constantly copied because it was a money machine. People staring into bright lights and precocious kid heroes and that fucking ILM storm cloud was in every other movie. Spielberg not only produced Poltergeist, but he also wrote the story and the screenplay. So of course the movie showcases a Spielbergian nuclear family, not a Hooper family. I'll point out Salem's Lot was a screenplay based on a novel by the second biggest Stephen in the world, Stephen King. Salem's Lot had a different feel and look than Chainsaw and Eaten Alive because Hooper adhered to a script when it was solid. Spielberg said he hired Hooper because of Chainsaw, but I think it was because of Salem's Lot. It's my opinion, but I think Spielberg needed to see that Hooper could do a bigger budget, more mainstream story before he wanted that Chainsaw brilliance. Now, were there issues with Hooper on the set? Yes. Craig Reardon, who worked with Hooper on Eaten Alive and Poltergeist, said that Hooper was too diffuse, which either means he was running all over the place or when he was asked questions, he rambled without getting to the point. Knowing Hooper's history, I'll go with number 2. But here's the dick move. Even if the set was utter chaos and Hooper was losing control and Spielberg had to come in and direct, this rumor never had to leave the set. And if it left the set, it could have been considered typical crew member resentment. But Spielberg, the biggest 500-pound gorilla of them all, who didn't have to answer to anyone, answered the question when someone asked it in an interview. And he answered with, Toby got a little behind, so... My question then is, why didn't you fire him and finish the movie on your own? That's industry standard, and Toby had it happen before, and you're a great director. Well, because he couldn't. Because he was already directing E.T., and directing 2 films simultaneously is a breach of DGA rules. So, Spielberg set up a situation where he might be put in a position where he might need to bend the rules, and he might need to protect his baby by picking up slack. Hooper didn't do it. Hooper just took a job. And yet, by not coming to bat for a fellow director and swallowing some pride, guess how the industry took those words from the most powerful director of the day. Even though Hooper had his name on a big hit, he didn't direct another movie until 1985. Round hole, square peg. Like I said, dick move. Are Spielberg's fingerprints on Poltergeist? Yes, as it is on Back to the Future and Goonies and Gremlins and Batteries Not Included and Young Sherlock Holmes and Inner Space. But nobody asks to see the shooting schedule for Goonies to see if Richard Donner was on the set. But I know that Tobe Hooper directed a lot of Poltergeist. You know why? The fierceness. That gut-dropping, child-threatening fierceness. Spielberg had it in 1975 with Jaws, but he didn't have it again until Schindler's List. He was comic book violent like Temple of Doom, and he could be a little scary, but he didn't have the fierceness to risk not entertaining the audience for a few minutes like Hooper did. And there is a fierceness, a true dread in Poltergeist during that first storm and the clown attack and the first moments of Carol Ann speaking over that television. In those scenes, I never once think of Spielberg. Now here's another question. Why does anyone care about this? Well, nobody did care in 1982. People only started caring after 1986, after they saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. After Poltergeist, the only thing Hooper got to direct was a Billy Idol music video, until he got a call from the producing team of Golan Globus, who helmed Cannon Pictures. Cannon's business model was to make B-movies as quickly as possible, sometimes with lavish budgets. On those budgets, by the way, their business model was also to move money around a lot and budgets would change. Golan giveth and Globus taketh away. Hooper signed a 3-picture deal, which had 2 catches. The first, he needed to do all 3 films in 2 years. And the second, one of the movies had to be a sequel to Chainsaw. The first film was the big-budget Life Force, which was entitled Space Vampires when Hooper came on board. Hooper went for an energy and mood that suited the original title, which he saw as an old Hammer film. Unfortunately, they changed the title to something more serious because of the budget. Hooper returned his surrealist style for Life Force, where extreme violence and absurd humor mix, and narrative logic takes a backseat to emotional imagery. The movie is indulgent and imperfect, but it fits Hooper's style. Unfortunately, he was now being judged by the style of Poltergeist, and the mainstream critics and Poltergeist fans saw a complete mess, and the movie tanked. Then he made the disappointing Invaders from Mars, which felt like an attempt to go the Spielbergian route. In my opinion, Invaders from Mars is far more Spielbergian than Poltergeist. It failed miserably at the box office, and a lot of us old fans wondered if he lost his edge when he got a bigger budget. We all had insanely high hopes for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. After a decade of obvious rip-offs to the story and the style of the original, Tobe Hooper was going to blow everyone's minds. What would he do with the idea that launched a million nightmares now that he had a big budget? Little did we know, Tobe Hooper had none of our enthusiasm for making a sequel. We also didn't know that Cannon slashed the budget after his first 2 movies tanked. Looking back on TCM2 after a few decades, I can say that it might be the most subversive film he ever made. His surrealist sensibilities are all over the film, with obvious absurd farce and satire, and the most gut-wrenching gore effects in any of his films, which were used for comedy. And it is a middle finger directly at Cannon Films for forcing him to make it. And it's like Texas Chainsaw meets Dr. Strangelove, where the movie's director is the Doomsday Machine. Hooper literally blows up the franchise and obliterates the cast so there wouldn't be any more sequels. I think I mentioned before that Tobe Hooper could be naive. So, that's how I feel about TCM2 now. Back in 1986, when I originally went to see it, I thought it was a middle finger directly at me. I thought it was an unoriginal retread of the original film with more gore and far less scares. It felt like a sellout. It felt like an 80s corporate greed cash grab that cared zero about horror fans. Little did I know that it started out as a scathing satire of 80s corporate greed cash grabs. In an interview, actress Caroline Williams talked about the movie Hooper shot versus the movie that Cannon recut and sent out to theaters. She said, "I hope someday Tobe can release the movie we made together because it was a brilliant satire." Of course, I wasn't looking for satire. I was looking for horror, like Tobe used to do. And this is where that idiosyncratic style, that surrealist sensibility, wore thin for horror. As I mentioned before, it was probably inevitable, because surrealism resists definitions, and it defies any established techniques, and Hooper saw horror as a much broader art form than I did at the time. And considering the miserable failure that TCM2 was, he saw it much broader than most of my generation of horror fans. I say my generation of horror fans because there's been some renewed appreciation for Hooper's films from generations that discover them on DVD and streaming services. Eaten Alive and The Funhouse and Life Force and even TCM2 and Spontaneous Combustion have cult followings now. And I think part of that is because horror has become a broader art form than it used to be, with many more diverse styles for those specific tastes. And I think that Hooper's gonzo film style is more interesting and more exciting than a lot of the bland retreads that are out there now. After TCM2, Tobe Hooper was relegated to low-budget horror films and television shows. He was mostly a gun for hire. Although there's usually at least one bizarre moment in each of his films that remind me of Tobe Hooper's unique genius, most of the movies as a whole are uninspired. The exceptions are his remake of Toolbox Murders and his 2 episodes of the Masters of Horror television show. He's one of the very few masters that made unique and quality episodes for that show. And I hope that Tobe Hooper gets his due in film history as a totally original and talented artist. Now, for those who want to denigrate his contributions to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, old guys like me, those who want to give the credit to Robert Burns and Wayne Bell and Daniel Pearl, let's talk value first. How much do you think the value of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is worth as a horror film and its impact to horror? Half an Exorcist? A quarter of Jaws? 2/3 of an Alien? Or do you think that Chainsaw is one of the greatest and most important and most valuable horror films we have? I'm betting the latter. So, if Robert Burns doesn't do the set design, there's a good chance it's a completely different movie. If Wayne Bell doesn't work on the sound design, there's a good chance it's a completely different movie. If Daniel Pearl doesn't run camera, there's a very good chance it's a completely different movie. If there is no Tobe Hooper, there is no movie. Period. It is never imagined. Rest in peace, Tobe Hooper. I hope they treat you better up there than we did here. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hell-bent.